Everybody, welcome back to part two of the reproductive system. So in part one, we learned about the male reproductive system. We covered the macroscopic anatomy, microscopic anatomy. Now we're going to learn all about the female reproductive system, and we're going to follow the same process of learning. We're going to start with the macroscopic anatomy, and then we're going to learn the small microscopic anatomy with the hormones. By far, I would say this is is way more complex in a female, how the hormones work, how the ovaries affect the uterus. So this part is going to be a little bit more detailed than in the male. Let's start with the external anatomy and internal anatomy of the female. So in general, the female reproductive system is composed by the vulva, vagina, uterus, fallopian tubes, which they're also known as uterine tubes. Most of people know them by fallopian tubes, two ovaries, and the breast. Now, important here to start is to know or to understand honestly what is the vulva. So the vulva is basically all this area that contains it's more like the external genitalia, the things that we can see externally. So the vulva contains everything that we can see here. So what are those things? So it contains the labia majora. Labia majora is a skin fold, as we're going to learn, that covers most of the vulva, right? So those are the portions that covers most of the vulva. When you retract the labia majora, also there's a second fold called the labia minora, which there's a little bit smaller. And there we can see also two little openings. One for the urethra, this is the urethral opening, and the opening for the vagina. So once again, all of this is what we call the vulva, the external genitalia. In the most superior area, we have the clitoris, or also known as the glans clitoris, with the prepuce. So this is very similar to the male, is the equivalent. The glans clitoris is the equivalent to the glans penis in a male, right? So what it is for a female is the equivalent for a male. And also notice that the anus is, of course, not part of the vulva. The anus is outside of that area. What is the mons pubis? The mons pubis that we're going to see in just a minute is an area right above the vulva with the pubic symphysis that contains adipose tissue and of course the hair that grows there. Let's look in more detail the vulva and their parts. So this is basically the same that I was showing you before, just with a little bit of more detail so you can see some of the internal parts. We mentioned the glans clitoris and the prepuce, and also notice that the corpus cavernosum, which is this structure that we have over here, is very similar. Again, is equivalent to the penis in a male, right? It has the same corpus cavernosum, has the glans clitoris, right? Now, important here that we didn't mention before is that with this opening, the vaginal opening, there are important glands that keeps the vagina, lubricated. Okay, these glands are called the Bartholin's glands. These glands are important. The Bartholin glands are below in the lateral aspect of the opening to the vagina. This is the opening for these Bartholin glands, and they release a fluid, a liquid, a secretion that is lubricant. So it maintains the vaginal canal moist. What is important because with the lack of this lubrication, even intercourse can become painful, and this turns relevant when females, for example, reach menopause, when they do not ovulate anymore. These glands start producing less of that lubricant fluid, and one of the symptoms that patients might have is itchiness, pain, or pain during intercourse. Okay, within the vaginal opening, also sometimes we're gonna see the hymen, which is a thin membrane that sometimes partially covers the entrance of the vagina. Okay, so something that we did when we learned about the male reproductive system is that when we learn the parts, right, internal anatomy, we start with the testicles and then epididymis, vas deferens, the glands, urethra, and then finally the penis. So we were following the way how the sperm will move through the male reproductive system. Now, in this case, with the female, we're going to do the approach is going to be a little bit different, and just because the ovaries, which are in the pelvic cavity, when they release the egg, the process called ovulation, the egg will be mobilized by peristalsis uh, through the fallopian tubes. In the case of a pregnancy, that fertilization takes place here in the fallopian tube. So really, the egg do not pass through the entire female reproductive system like the male did. So in this case, we started with the external genitalia, which was the vulva, and what parts are the ones that forms the vulva. Now we're going to learn about the vagina, then the uterus, fallopian tubes, and finally the ovaries. So with the vagina is just this muscular canal that the main function is that it serves to the is the entrance for the reproductive system, basically communicates the vulva with the uterus. And we know that through the vaginal canal is the place where all the endometrium, which is the innermost layer of the uterus, when it sheds during menstrual period, that's the way how all this tissue and blood exit the female reproductive system. But also during pregnancy, at the end of pregnancy, during labor, the way how the baby gets out is through the vaginal canal. So important here from the reproductive point of view is to know that the normal vaginal canal and vagina has a pH with has a acidic pH, a pH that's below 4.5. And we mentioned that this acid needs to be neutralized by the semen, so the sperm will be able to swim in order for the sperm to reach the fallopian tube and then fertilize the egg. So that's why the prostate gland was important, because that alkaline fluid was produced there with that. Now, what keeps this vaginal canal acid is because within the vagina there is a normal microorganisms called lactobacillus, which are the ones that they're bacteria. They're good bacteria. They're bacteria that produces this lactic acid, which maintains the pH of the vagina acid, and that also the acidity prevents from other bacteria to growth in the vaginal canal, prevents against infections by pathogens, by yeast, or other organisms. And also we can include there that destroy sperm. So that's the importance of the prostate gland secretion, right, to neutralize that acidity. Importance also with an anatomy is just to know that the vagina is just this canal that communicates the outside, the vulva, with the uterus, which is what we're going to cover now. Okay, now let's talk about the uterus. So there's important things that we need to look through the uterus. First is to know the general locations and what structures are around the uterus, right? So this is a lateral view. It's a sagittal, mid-sagittal cross-section of the pelvis, female pelvis. So everything we see here is half of what you can see. So important here is notice the uterus is this organ. Below here we have the vagina. And what is important to recognize is that the uterus is on top of the urinary bladder. Okay, so this is the bladder, and we have urethra, and of course this is the vulva. And we just said that we have labia majora, labia minora, and the opening for the urethral opening is superior to the vaginal opening, right? So that makes sense. That's the first thing. The next thing that we need to know is that the uterus has sections, okay? So you need to remember that, sections versus layers or wall layers. Okay, the thickness of the uterus. The uterus is a hollow organ, so it has a space. It's I was saying it's a hollow organ, meaning that in the center, that's where the uterine cavity is located, right? So this is the wall, this is the thickness of the uterus, and the uterus has. Uh, so we need to learn other than the location of the uterus, the sections of the uterus, the thickness, the walls, right, and the ligaments that keep not just the uterus but the rest of the reproductive system organs in place. So we're going to learn in just a minute what are the ligaments related or associated with the uterus that keep the organ in place. With the sections, we can see that the uterine has three major sections, as we can see here in this picture. The most superior is the fundus, the body in yellow, and then the inferior portion called the cervix. Now, this is something that, excuse me, I would like to clarify here that the cervix is part of the uterus. The cervix is actually what we know as the neck of the uterus. Think about the cervical region, okay? Cervical region refers to the neck of the human body. Cervical and cervix, the name cervix refers to the neck of the uterus. Important here is also with the location of the cervix. Notice that because it's the inferior portion of the uterus, this is the part that is in direct contact with the vagina. So the vagina is inferior to the cervix. And because of the cervix also is in that area, we there's a condition, okay? There's the cervical cancer is the most often it's one of the most often type of cancer that occur in females, and most of the time, like almost 70 to 90% of the time, is associated with an infection, a viral infection with human papilloma virus. Human papilloma virus is a sexual transmitted disease that, of course, you get through sexual intercourse, and not all the viruses, not all the papilloma viruses will cause cervical cancer, but the types of human papilloma virus that are associated with cervical cancer are the 16 and 18. Those are the ones that we call high risks, and there's a vaccine that is available to prevent infection with human papillomavirus. The vaccine protects you against this and other types that are high risk for development of cervical cancer. Now, cervical cancer can be detected early by pap smears. So what is a pap smear? Pap smear is when you take a sample of the cervix. So through the vaginal canal, through the vagina, a speculum helps to open the vaginal canal so the physician can look at the cervix and then take a sample of the cervix. Then this sample of the cervix is the one that is sent to the pathologist so they can look at the cells, and based on the morphology and things that they do with the cells, they can determine if the cells of the samples look normal, or if they're suspicious, or if they highly suspicious. If they're highly suspicious, there are other tests that you do after, but that is beyond the the scope of the class to cover that. For the purpose of general knowledge, know that the cervix is this area where cervical cancer occur and is associated with a viral infection caused by human papillomavirus. Now let's review the walls of, or the layers of the uterus. So from outside to inside, so from outermost to innermost, we have the perimetrium. The perimetrium is the outermost or most superficial layer. It's this little layer that covers all this area. The thickest and muscular part, the one that is responsible for the uterine contractions during menses or menstruation, but also during labor, right, is the myometrium. So that's the one in the middle, myometrium. Okay? And then lastly, the innermost endometrium is the layer that is the one that is in contact with the lumen, is the layer that will receive the fertilized egg if there is pregnancy, and this is the place where these fertilized eggs will implant. So the endometrium is the innermost, is composed by two sublayers. One is called the stratum functionalis, and this is the one that sheds during menses, during menstruation. And the other is the stratum uh, uh, basal or basalis. This is the one that is right in contact with the myometrium. So important to remember here, or to have an idea. During the menstrual cycle, the endometrium is the layer of the uterus that will grow, will become thicker during, and this type of tissue is very sensitive to hormones. We're going to learn that the hormones produced by the ovaries are the ones that are going to induce the growth and enlargements of the thickness of the endometrium. So we'll see when we learn the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle how the hormones can affect the thickness of this endometrium, and what's going to happen if pregnancy happens or occurs, and what happens with this endometrium if pregnancy does not occur. Now, the ligaments, we're going to focus right now in the ligaments associated with the uterus, but many of these ligaments, they also support other reproductive system organs. Now, these are the three major organs, the three major ligaments that support the uterus. The broad ligament, as the name implies, broad, is connective tissue that attaches but to the uterus, of course, but also to other organs, as we're going to see later, the fallopian tubes and even the ovaries. So what is this broad ligament? We can see this in this illustration. This is this sheet-like connective tissue, sheet-like shaped connective tissue that is very broad, so it anchors to many parts of the reproductive system. As you can see here with the uterus, it will be this, okay? Then also we have the round ligament. Round ligament is also, to understand this picture, we need to understand that this is the interior part, meaning that's the front. This is the posterior part, this is the back. You can see here the rectum, the sigmoid colon, the rectum, and the anus. This is a superior view, so we just imagine that we're looking at this from the top. Now, the bladder is below and in front of the uterus. So anteriorly, the round ligament is this ligament that anchors to the uterus and then anteriorly attaches to the labia majora. Okay, this is the round ligament. The third and last ligament is the uterosacral ligament, and as the name implies, it's a ligament that starts or connects the uterus with the sacrum or the sacral region and stabilizes the uterus posteriorly. We know that the sacrum is in the back, and this is the uterosacral ligament. The sacrum will be located here. The sacrum is that triangular shaped bone that, in this case, support the uterus through this ligament. Now that we've covered the uterus, let's move on and cover the uterine tubes. That's another term for fallopian tubes. So there are two fallopian tubes. They are basically what connects the ovaries with the uterus. Okay, we can simplify or think about that way. Of course, there are two tubes, so that means there's a hole, there's a lumen, and the fallopian tube has three major sections. Okay, the section that is closer to the uterus is called the isthmus. So the isthmus, you can see here, this is the fundus of the uterus in terms of section. The isthmus is that little portion of the fallopian tube that connects the uterus. The longest portion of the fallopian tube is what we call the ampulla, okay? And the portion of the fallopian tube that is closer to the ovary is called the infundibulum, Okay, this is the infundibulum. Is the wider portion of the fallopian tube, and at the end has these finger-like projections. They're called the fimbria. So the fimbria is really part of the infundibulum, and during ovulation is the medical term to describe the release of the cell, of the germ cell, that mature and growth in the ovary, and every month that little egg, that gamete or germ cell will be uh, released from the ovary, from the follicle, and will be transported through the fimbria and through movements called peristalsis, and also um, the fimbria has these finger-like projections, these ciliate cells that moves and transport the egg towards the uterus. Now this takes time, so the movement is slow. If sperm is present, the sperm most of the time will reach the egg at the level of the ampulla. This is where most of the time fertilization takes place, here in the ampulla. And then once the eggs get fertilized, the process of descending will continue, and then implantation will take place here in the endometrium. Okay, if there's no pregnancy, the egg eventually will not implantate and will be shedded with the rest of the endometrium when the hormonal levels drop. Okay, let's cover this last portion before we learn in detail or review the microscopic anatomy and physiology of the female reproductive system. The last organ that we need to cover here are the ovaries. The ovaries are the equivalent to the testicles or the testes, so those are the gonads of the female, and they contain the germ cells in the same way how the testicles contain the germ cells in the male. Now, I want to clarify something just before we keep going. Males produce sperms all the time. So the production of and reabsorption of a sperm is a process that is a continuous process that begins during puberty, when the male start releasing large amounts of testosterone, and the spermatogenesis process begins. Then this process continues. So we can think that males will produce billions of sperms during the whole lifetime. Now in females this is different. Now females, they the ovaries, even though there are two, generally speaking, they produce a single egg gets mature or increases in size and gain maturity every month. So there's just one single um, germ cell or gamete in the female, right? And we learned from the previous class that um, from the beginning, when um, the germ cell was completely mature and suffers meiosis one, this meiosis one get paused. We're going to see this in just in a second when we look at the details. But just know, for now, that during each menstrual cycle, during each month, only one gamete will be the one who will be selected, the one that will grow, and the others will be um, paused, or they will not be released during ovulation. The ovaries, are in the same way how many of the organs contains a cortex and medulla. The cortex is the outermost portion, is the functional portion of this little gland. The medulla is the center, and that's the one that contains blood vessels, lymphatic, nerves, etc. I have the medulla in red to illustrate that. And the cortex, I color this in green for you, so it's the outermost. All these things um, that you can see here at the beginning are the ovaries and the eggs and follicles, how they grow. As they grow each menstrual cycle, eventually this egg will be released from this follicle or little sac that has been containing it, and then this little sac will produce hormones, and eventually if there's pregnancy, will continue producing hormones. If pregnancy does not occur, then this, what we call the corpus luteum, will degrade and will become the corpus albicans, and then menses will occur. All of this if pregnancy does not occur. Okay, now let's learn in detail the microscopic anatomy. Here is the part that you need to kind of have, I would say, personally think that is the more complex part, because we're going to see there's a lot of hormones. Some things are happening in the ovary at the same time that it happened in the endometrium, in the uterus. So let's pay attention to this part, because from the class I think is the hardest portion to understand. Okay, so there are going to be two things that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about them separately first, but just keep in mind that they're related. One thing is what we call the ovarian cycle, which definitely, I mean, just by reading that is something that occurs in the ovaries, right? And there is something else called the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle is something that occurs in the uterus. Now, what you need to know is that the ovarian cycle is responsible for the menstrual cycle. So whatever the ovaries and the hormones produced by the ovaries, they will directly impact in what's going to happen to the uterus, and specifically to the endometrium. Okay, let's just start from there. So right now we're going to look what is happening here in the ovary and what is this ovarian cycle. So we need to know two things. First, that the gametes, okay, the process of maturation and fully growth and maturation of a germ cell of one gamete is what we call oogenesis. So oogenesis is the production of gametes, and it's more complex than in a male, as we're going to learn in just a second. But this refers, the word genesis means creation or production, right? And O refers to the egg. Folliculogenesis is another term, or is something that refers to the growth and development of the ovarian follicle. So what is the ovarian follicle? If we look at this picture that I mentioned before, I want you to look at just this specific portion that I'm circulating here. So this model is showing these little red dots, okay? This little red dot represents the gamete, represents the egg, okay? Now, notice that the egg is wrapped by uh, a follicle. So the follicle is all this group of cells that are around the egg, okay? So as the ovarian cycle progress, the follicle start becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, and the cells that compose this follicle start producing hormones, and those are the hormones that we are going to talk about. They are the hormones that come from the ovaries, estrogen and progesterone. So estrogen and progesterone are hormones produced by the cells that form the follicle that wraps the egg, that wraps the female gamete. In some point, the follicle will grow and will be big enough that the process of ovulation will occur. What is ovulation? Ovulation is basically that moment when the follicle releases the egg, see the little dot, into the fallopian tube, okay? And then, as we're gonna see in some point, this follicle then receive the name of corpus luteum, and then the ovary, the ovum or the egg will be released, and then we'll see what happened after that. So the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle, I think that's correlate each other, and there's all these four hormones that are important to know, because um, it's important to know that these hormones are going to affect the ovaries, but also they're going to affect the uterus uh, indirectly. All right, let's look at the oogenesis first, which is the formation, growth, and production of gametes, in this case, in the female, right? Germ cells. So If we contrast this with the male, things are a little bit different, and there are things that they're going to be very similar. What things are similar in the process of oogenesis in a female versus the spermatogenesis that occurs in a male is first is that in both cases we're going to have meiosis. So we're going to have meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. So in both, they're meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. Now, the difference here is that in the male, the spermatogenesis, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2 will occur and will be complete very quickly. In a female, as we're going to see in just in a minute, there are parts where meiosis gets stopped or paused, and then there's going to be an event that will trigger or will stimulate that continuity of the process. Let's look at this so it will make more sense. So everything starts here with a stem cell that will, by mitosis, will produce primary oocytes. Now, with the male, we have also stem cells, but stem cells produce spermatogonia all the time through the entire life. So when the boy reaches puberty, this process starts, and these stem cells produce these spermatogonias until, advanced age. In the female, it's different. In the female, these stem cells will produce a certain amount of primary oocyte, and then the number will not change. So after this, there will be no new production of primary oocytes. So let's just use an easy number. For example, let's use 400. Let's say that the stem cell produces in total 400 primary oocytes, and that's the number that will not change anymore. There's not going to be more production of those cells. All this is happening before birth. So when the baby is still in the mother's womb, we'll have in the ovaries, let's say 400 primary oocytes. These oocytes will enter meiosis 1, but they will not complete meiosis 1. They're going to be arrested in prophase. Remember that mitosis is the process of cellular division in somatic cells. And mitosis has phases. You learned this in AMP1, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. Meiosis is almost the same. It's pretty much the same. It's just that meiosis refers to that process, but in the germ cells. So notice that it's in prophase, okay, where the cell gets arrested. So all the primary oocytes get arrested in prophase. When this will return or will continue once the girl reaches puberty. So after puberty, right, when that process starts, is when meiosis 1 will resume, okay, and puberty at the beginning of puberty. So what happens now is that after puberty, then meiosis 1 continues, and then you have instead of having primary oocyte, the result of this meiosis 1 or this division will give you the first polar body plus a secondary oocyte. The secondary oocyte will start meiosis 2, but will be arrested in metaphase. So in metaphase, will be arrested and it will stay paused in metaphase. This is happening to all the 400 primary oocytes. So all of them are arrested in metaphase. Now, with each menstrual cycle, only one out of all these 400 is the one that will increase in size, that will grow, and is the one that eventually will be released during ovulation. So let's say that the secondary oocyte grows and then it's released during ovulation. Okay, this ovulation is basically just mark that this secondary oocyte is released, and then the only moment in which this secondary oocyte will resume, okay, to complete meiosis 2 is if it gets penetrated by a sperm. Okay, so if there's no penetration by a sperm, the secondary oocyte will never resume the metaphase, and eventually um, will get lost during menses. If there's fertilization, meaning if the sperm penetrates the secondary oocyte, in that specific moment is when that secondary oocyte completes meiosis 2. Okay, so that is the moment in which then you will have the formation of another um, polar body, but then a mature ovum. Okay, that was oogenesis. Now let's look at folliculogenesis. Folliculogenesis has to do with the cells, the growth around the secondary oocytes that we talk about. Okay, so let's look at these stages. Let's look at this, how they grow, and you will see that the hormones that promote folliculogenesis and oogenesis are the same LH and FSH that in males trigger the production of testosterone and the growth and maturation of spermatogonia. So notice FSH stands for follicle follicle stimulating hormone. The follicle stimulating hormone that we're referring to is this one. So there are several stages of the follicle. First, notice that this is a cell. This is the oocyte that we talk about, and the nucleus is here. We know that this nucleus contains 23 chromosomes, and the last chromosome is an X. We know also that all these chromosomes are still trapped in meiosis 2, and they're paused in metaphase. The only time when this process will be completed will be if the sperm penetrates that oocyte. Second is that we have a few cells, um, and this is again, this is the entire oocyte. This is the nucleus with the chromosomes. So this oocyte is surrounded by cells. Okay, these cells are the ones that are going to form the follicle. At the beginning, there's just a few, but as the process and as the hormones, especially FSH, start increasing, FSH is the hormone that triggers the growth of more cells, okay, of the follicle. So now when you have more cells, they're called the granulosa cells. Those are the cells that form the primary follicle, okay, the primary follicle. A secondary follicle is a follicle that has even more cells. Notice that what we know now as the egg is this little cell with the nucleus and the chromosomes, and see how much the follicle, these blue cells, has growth at this point. So we have granulosa cells and we have theca cells. All of these together is what forms the follicle. And these cells are the ones that are going to produce hormones, okay? Estrogen and progesterone. So when the tertiary follicle forms, notice how huge it is now comparing with the oocyte. The oocyte is this little tiny cell, okay? We can see it, there's so little now because the follicular cells or the follicle has grown so much. See how large it is. So these cells that form those follicles are the ones that I told you that produce the hormones progesterone and estrogen and progesterone, right? So the hormone that stimulates the growth of this follicle is FSH. Now, in some point, the increase in amount of estrogen is going to stimulate the pituitary gland to produce more LH. And then we're going to learn that eventually, when the when the when there's a peak of LH production by this follicle, that will trigger the event of ovulation. Ovulation is basically when the follicle release the egg. So you'll see that if this is the ovary, okay, this is what we know as the follicle, and this release of the egg, the oocyte, is what we call ovulation. After that, after the egg is released for the follicle, now the tertiary follicle is no longer called tertiary follicle, and now is called the corpus luteum. So see the events that has occurred so far. Let's just recap. We start with the primary follicle, because FSH is increasing. FSH stimulates the growth of these follicle cells, together with LH, right? It start growing, and start producing estrogen and progesterone, primarily estrogen at this point. In some point, one single follicle will predominate and will prevent the other follicles mature. So we're going to have, in this process, only one follicle growing big to tertiary, and that follicle is the one that in some point will produce a large amount of estrogen. This estrogen peak will stimulate the pituitary gland to release a large amount of LH, luteinizing hormone. With this high peak of LH, that is the trigger for the release of the egg from the follicle. This process is what we call ovulation. After ovulation, after the egg is released, then the tertiary follicle, the remaining cells of the follicle, then will be called corpus luteum, and those are the cells that will keep producing progesterone. Okay, progesterone. Progesterone will stay high until the egg is fertilized by a sperm. If the egg is not fertilized, the corpus luteum then will decay or degrade to corpus albicans, and then eventually menstruation will occur. If pregnancy occurs, the corpus luteum will maintain or will keep producing progesterone until the placenta of the baby take place in the production of progesterone. So this is what happens with the hormone LH. Okay, prior ovulation, remember that FSH and LH are the hormones that stimulate the growth and maturation of the theca and granulosa cells. Those are the cells that form the follicle. Okay, now as the follicle grows from secondary to tertiary, these theca cells produce primarily estrogen, and the levels of estrogen start increasing. There's a point in which there's a lot of estrogen, and when you have certain amount of estrogen, which is very large, that triggers the release of even more LH by the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland, in response of a large amount of estrogen, produces a large amount of LH. This large amount of LH is the hormone that produces or that stimulates the event of ovulation. We said that ovulation is the process in which the oocyte gets released from the tertiary Okay, so we said that a tertiary follicle is when you have the egg is still inside, so LH increases, and that triggers the release of the egg outside. The tertiary follicle becomes the corpus luteum, and that is what we call ovulation. Now, post-ovulation, okay, post-ovulation, the LH will still keep stimulating the corpus luteum, but now notice that these theca cells and granulosa cells, which we know that are in the corpus luteum, are going to be the ones that are going to produce progesterone. Okay, so see how now the hormone is no longer estrogen but progesterone, and this progesterone If pregnancy occur, so yes, pregnancy will stay high. If no pregnancy, they will drop, and then when they drop, that will trigger menses in the uterus. Okay, so we reviewed the ovarian cycle. Now let's talk about the menstrual cycle. Now the best way to understand this is to look at both ovarian cycle and menstrual cycle at the same time, because depending on what is happening in the ovary is what is going to be happening is what is going to happen in the uterus. So for now, let's look at the menstrual cycle first, but then we're going to look at those together because that's the best way to understand what's happening. Now, menstrual cycle, remember that this is what happens in the uterus, okay? And specifically, the part that we need to look at is the endometrium. So the menstrual cycle is all about the endometrium and the uterus. What I have here in this picture is showing you the thickness of the endometrium. Okay, so notice that during menstruation, that's when the endometrium sheds and tears and gets exposed. The endometrium will be very thin. Okay, very thin. As the menstruation process finalizes or is complete, then we enter to one of the phases, which is called the proliferative phase. This is when the endometriums become growing again. So all of this is occurring because the presence of hormones. We're going to learn which hormones, but just notice that this phase, the uterus and specifically endometrium, become thicker. Eventually, and this number is important, 14, after ovulation, notice that in that point is when the endometrium will reach the maximum or the max thickness. Okay, if pregnancy occur, this will remain. If pregnancy does not occur, that's when all these endometrium will degrade and shed and will cycle will repeat, menses will repeat. Okay, so what are the three phases of the menstrual cycle? The menses phase, which is the bleeding part. The proliferative phase, which as the name implies, refers to the proliferation or growing of the endometrium. And then the secretory phase is also growing of endometrium, but it's growing even more. Okay, hormones produced by the ovaries control these three phases, okay, these three menstrual phases. So whatever is happening to the endometrium is because the amount of hormones that are being produced by the ovaries. Okay, so now we're going to look at those together, the menstrual cycle, and we're going to contrast that with the ovarian cycle. So in this picture, I have here the ovarian cycle, okay, the ovary, and we're going to look at the follicular or folliculogenesis primarily. This is happening in the ovary. And this one, of course, the one that we have here, is occurring in the uterus. So everything starts, let's start this menstrual cycle with the first day of menses, okay, menstruation. So we're looking at the uterus here. The first day of menses. Usually, or on average, the time can vary, but menses can last between 4 to 6 days. Okay, in general, 5 days. This is the time when the endometrium is shedding, bleeding, and tissues are um, um, tissue is being released by the endometrium through the vaginal canal and to the outside. So the reason why menses is occurring, I'm going to anticipate here, is because there's too few progesterone. Okay, so this lack of progesterone is what or this decrease in progesterone production is what triggers menses, which is when all of these endometrium basically get shed and lost. Okay, this was the time when the egg, or this occurs because the egg was not fertilized. Okay, because the egg was not fertilized, the egg get lost, and then there's not more production of progesterone. Okay, so then notice that here is when we don't have any follicles. Okay, because the previous follicle, the one that released the egg that did not get fertilized, got degraded. Okay, so then the cycle repeats. So now we're going to look at the ovary, and let's see what happens in the ovary. So let's look at first the menses and see what happens in the ovary at that specific time. Before we start in detail, let's look at some of the medical terminology. The medical term for menarche. Menarche refers to the first menses after puberty. Okay, and the menses phase, menses or menstruation, which is the same, as I mentioned before, it varies between person to person, but it lasts or is between 2 to 7 days of bleeding. Okay, that is menses. That's the normal um, uh, interval of bleeding, right? And as I mentioned before, menses occur because of low progesterone levels. So low progesterone levels affect the arteries that supply blood to the endometrium. These arteries constrict, and then the endometrium gets do not get blood supply, which trigger endometrial tissue um, dies and then sheds through the vagina. Okay, this is because pregnancy did not occur. So once again, look at what's happening in the menses or menstruation, and see what's happening in the ovary. So in the ovary, I told you before, we don't have any follicles that produce hormones because there was not pregnancy. So now in the ovary, while this is occurring in the uterus, the ovary is getting ready and making a new follicle. So, but these primordial follicles and primary follicles, they're so immature at this point that they do not produce hormones. Okay, so at this point, FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, released by the pituitary gland, is producing hormones to stimulate the growth and maturation of these primary follicles. Right? At this point, this is happening at the same time. Okay. After let's take 7, right, as an average. Let's say that now we have the follicular phase. Okay, in this follicular phase still, we have now secondary follicles. So when we start having secondary follicles, that means that these cells that form these follicles now will produce hormones. And these hormones are the ones that are going to stimulate the next phase in the uterus. So let's look at that now. So if we look at this picture in the ovary, during the follicular phase, one single follicle grows enough or become very big, and the other ones get um, the other ones will not be able to make it, or will get inhibited by this big and single follicle. So this tertiary follicle now produces hormones. Remember that the hormones that we said that before ovulation, the main hormone responsible or that will increase will be estrogen. Okay, so this estrogen produced by this tertiary follicle in the follicular phase, okay, is the one that will stimulate the endometrium to growth. Okay, so and that is the proliferative phase that is occurring in the uterus. Notice that at this point the egg is still trapped within the follicle, so ovulation has not occurred yet. And that is the importance of ovulation. So ovulation is a very important event because it marks the end of the proliferative phase in the uterus, but also the end of the follicular phase in the ovary. So ovulation is a pretty important phase. So prior ovulation, we mentioned before, estrogen levels start increasing in amount. So estrogen increases. We said that when estrogen increases, that triggers, okay, that elevation in estrogen stimulates the release of LH by the pituitary gland. And then we said before that this high peak or high concentration of LH is what triggers ovulation. And then we know that ovulation is that event where the tertiary follicle will release the egg outside of the ovary. Okay, so now let's look at that in the next slide. In the ovary, after ovulation occurs, then is when we start talking about the luteal phase. The luteal phase is the phase that occurs in the ovary after ovulation. What remains from the tertiary follicle now is called the corpus luteum. So basically the corpus luteum is a tertiary follicle without the egg. Okay? All the cells of the corpus luteum will produce hormones, but now instead of estrogen, the primary hormone or the hormone that will be more elevated will be progesterone. Okay, so as you can see here, progesterone produced by the corpus luteum is what stimulates this phase in the uterus. So it's the amount of the increase in progesterone that now makes the endometrium to grow even more. So initially in the proliferative phase, we learned there was estrogen, the hormone produced by the tertiary follicle, the one that stimulates the endometrium to growth. After ovulation, there's a switch between estrogen and progesterone. Now, after ovulation, the main hormone is progesterone, and this progesterone stimulates even more the growth of the endometrium. This in the uterus is called the secretory phase. Okay, so the secretory phase is immediately after ovulation. It's ovulation, the corpus luteum is the one that produces progesterone. Okay, now here's the key part. Okay, and this is day 14 is average the day of ovulation from 0 to 14. So then two things will occur. So, or there are two possibilities here in this specific phase. So if pregnancy, so then the corpus luteum will keep producing progesterone, which is the main hormone that will maintain pregnancy. Okay, so and this corpus luteum will keep producing progesterone until the egg, until in this case now the zygote, which is when the egg and the sperm fuse. Now the cell is called the zygote. When the zygote implants and then start growing cells and eventually the placenta, the progesterone produced by the corpus luteum is what maintains pregnancy. Okay, then the placenta will take place, and the placenta eventually, once the placenta forms and growth, then the placenta will be the main organ in charge of the production of progesterone. Progesterone, as you can imagine, is a very important hormone to maintain pregnancy. And in fact, and the clinical relevance of this is that if you see a pregnant woman with getting progesterone shots, is because they're trying to save pregnancy. Okay, the other possibility is that if there's no pregnancy, so if no pregnancy, what is going to happen is that the corpus luteum will start, will degrade and will become the corpus albicans. Okay, albicans. So this corpus luteus, which is the one that produces progesterone, if there's no pregnancy, will become corpus albicans, and the corpus albicans, because it's degrading, it start producing less and less progesterone. And we know that when you have low progesterone, that low progesterone is what triggers menses, as we mentioned this at the beginning. Okay, so is this decrease in progesterone the one that triggers menses, and the cycle repeats. Let's to finish and let's summarize what we just covered. There are two things we're gonna see here: what's happening in the ovary. Let's gonna see here what's happening in the uterus. Let's look at here what's happening with the hormones. Okay, so we're gonna start with menses, which is when the bleeding, right? Menses occur because there was no pregnancy. The egg never got fertilized, and we know that if there's no pregnancy, we know that progesterone is low. So progesterone is low. There's no follicle, because we said that the corpus albicans, it degrades, and that was the one that produces progesterone. So in the ovary, at this point, there's nothing there. There's maybe residuals of the corpus albicans. So that low progesterone is what causes the endometrium to shed and the bleeding of menstruation. So at the same time, as you can see, FSH start increasing. Okay, so FSH increases. FSH is the hormone that will stimulate the maturation of a new follicle. Okay, new follicle. As these processes start, and remember that menstruation usually lasts between 5 to 7 days, the menstruation will stop once there's not enough, once the endometrium is completely thin. At that time, in the ovaries, a secondary follicle is growing. And this secondary follicle now is growing more and more, and then eventually a secondary follicle will become a tertiary follicle. This tertiary follicle is huge, it's very big, and is able to produce hormones. Okay, so in the ovary, this phase is called the follicular phase. And it makes sense because follicular phase basically means that the ovary is making a new follicle. So the tertiary follicle and the follicular phase, the cells, the granulosa and theca cells, are the ones that are going to produce the hormone estrogen. As you can see here, the estrogen levels start rising, and that increase in estrogen is what in the uterus we know as proliferative phase. The presence of estrogen is what stimulates the growth of endometrium. Okay. Then we know also that this large amount of estrogen in the uterus is causing the endometrium to grow. But also, this amount of estrogen is what triggers in the pituitary gland the release and production of FSH, of LH. So you can see here that once estrogen increases, see what happens with the LH, also peaks. And we know now that the peak or the elevation of LH is what triggers ovulation. Ovulation in the ovary is represented by the release of the egg outside of the ovary. The egg gets released into that fallopian tube, and the egg start moving, okay, from the fallopian tube in their way to the uterus. And the ovary the tertiary follicle now becomes the corpus luteum. So now we're looking at the moment after ovulation. After ovulation in the ovary, this is called the luteal phase. Luteal phase because now we have corpus luteum. In this corpus luteum, in this phase, let me erase here really quick so it doesn't look messy. So these cells of the corpus luteum now are the ones that are going to produce progesterone. Notice what happens before ovulation. Okay, so before ovulation, we have LH, that peak is what triggers ovulation, but also look with estrogen. Estrogen here, prior ovulation was very high. Look what happened with estrogen post-ovulation. The levels become a little bit lower. Prior ovulation, the levels of progesterone were very low, right? And then after ovulation, progesterone, as you can see here, start getting high or elevated, right? This is because the corpus luteum after ovulation is the main source of progesterone. And it's this increase in progesterone, the one that stimulates the secretory phase that takes place in the uterus. So the growth of the endometrium in the secretory phase is because the increased amount of progesterone produced by the corpus luteum. And then we know that if the egg that was released gets fertilized by sperm, there's not going to be menstruation. What it's going to be is a baby in 9 months. So the progesterone will keep this endometrium this thick, and that's when the placenta will attach to the endometrium. And then when the placenta attaches in the endometrium and makes the connection and blood supply take place, the placenta will grow and the placenta will produce progesterone that will eventually will be the responsible to maintaining progesterone levels during pregnancy. If pregnancy does not occur, that means that the corpus luteum, clean here, will degrade to corpus albicans. And with the degradation of the corpus albicans, we know that less progesterone is produced. And then when you have less progesterone, that is what will trigger menses. And that concludes our class in female reproductive system.